there's a couple things on the brake system. One, a lot of people seem normally initially when they first get their car, getting the brakes bled correctly. You know, they have a soft pedal and they bleed it. And you might touch on that because you know we know that a lot of it's dependent on how they run the brake lines and actually how long they try to bleed the brakes. I've had people try to help me bleed the brakes and always have a soft pedal, and then I find out that they're only pushing the pedal halfway down where we're bleeding. But you might touch on that because that's a question a lot of people have.
There's a lot of new cars going together now. So you have a lot of completely empty brake systems to start with. So if we're going to work with a new car, definitely pay attention how the lines are ran. You want to try to have none of the lines running to the front of the car that get above the fluid level in the master cylinder. If you do that, that's a good place to trap air in it. First and foremost, you start bleeding the brakes. Absolutely, you need to bench bleed the master cylinder. Simply disconnect the line, connect a short piece of hard line or flex line, either way, to the master cylinder and loop it over into the master cylinder. Fill the master cylinder up and then slowly pump the master cylinder until you work all the air out of the inner chamber of the master cylinder itself. Once you have that done, connect your line back up. And then what I like to do is start, let's say if we're starting in the rear of the car, start the right rear, have someone open the bleeder up, push the pedal all the way to the floor, close the bleeder off. Open the bleeder up, push pedal all the way to the floor, close the bleeder off. What that'll do is that'll quickly push fluid to that caliper. So I work my way around the car, right rear, left rear, and then right front, left front, doing that procedure and getting fluid to the caliper, trying to get everything pushed out of the line as best I can. Once I got fluid at the caliper itself, then I like to simply slowly pump the pedal 3 times, hold pressure against it, open the bleeder up, push the pedal to the floor. You don't have to push, crazy hard, just slowly push it to the floor, close the bleeder off, let up, slowly pump it again 3 times. And what's key there is you want to slowly pump the pedal. If you pump the pedal real fast and vigorous, it's like taking a soda bottle and shaking it up. You just foam everything that's inside the lines. And it's hard to get that oil out or the air out of the fluid. But usually once you work your way around the car like that, again, right rear, right front, left front, that will typically get the pedal where you've got a good pedal. If you do all that and you feel like, hey, I got a good pedal, you get back in the car, 30 minutes to an hour later, and the first stroke, the pedal goes to the floor. You have air in the line. It doesn't matter how many times you bleed the brakes and you think you don't get any air out of the line, you've got air in the lines if that happens. And what typically causes it is the rear brake lines get above the master cylinder fluid level. So where the line goes to the rear of the car and T's to go left rear and right rear, usually that T gets above the fluid level. Or over the left rear and right rear tire, a lot of people will loop a brake line up and then run it straight down, and that loop gets above the fluid level in the master cylinder. So if you have that, what I'd recommend doing is crack the fittings at those T's or at those unions and bleed the brakes there, and then work my way to the caliper and bleed them again. If you do that, you'll work the air out of it. But definitely, if you've got a soft pedal, you got a pedal that goes straight to the floor, it's got air in the system.
I found kind of the same problem when you're trying to bleed out your transmission too, especially like a Falcon transmission or a Brin. A lot of times the initial bleeding procedure is tough with those, getting the air out. The way you first described to do the brakes as open the bleeder up, push the pedal down, then close the bleeder, really helps on the transmission.
On transmissions, that's a huge help. And then also the bench bleeding in the master cylinder is another huge help. You'll be surprised how much better pedal you'll have if you just do that process. Now, if you do all that and you feel like I've got a really firm pedal, and then you feel like you have that little sponginess still in the system. Couple things to look at. One, look at the mounts of the brake pedals themselves and make sure you don't have a lot of flex there, because any of that kind of flex will give you a little bit of a spongy pedal feel. The other thing that we run into common with dirt modified, for instance, is, a lot of dirt modifieds, they run a 7/8 rear, 1-inch front. They do that trying to get rear bias in the car. The problem with that is the 1-inch master cylinder will always get stiff first. You'll feel it get hard with the pedal, and then you feel that little extra travel because the 7/8 has to travel farther to get more pressure than the 1-inch. The 7/8 will end up with more pressure, but you have to travel it farther. Now, if you look at a handling issue, an aspect of that is now when you start putting brakes in the car, your 1-inch master cylinder getting pressure first is typically your front calipers or your front system. So you'll get a push in the car, and then your rear master cylinder will catch up. No matter where you have the bias crank, the 1-inch master cylinder always gets pressure first. It may be instant, just a split second, but sometimes that's all you need to shear the contact of the front tires. So what I'd recommend doing is, definitely I like running the same size master cylinder front and rear, whether it be 7/8, whether it be 1-inch. That's just a little bit of a driver's preference. And then you can build bias in the car nowadays with brake pads. We don't have to build it with the pressure of the master cylinders or of the brake system. We can do it with the pads itself.
Now, on the brake bias, I know a lot of people have issues. They buy a car, they put fluid in the master cylinders and pump them up and go race, and they never check out their brake bias on whether it's centered up. There's a lot to that. I've seen people have handling problems for half a year, and the main reason, and even if they've got the cranked all the way to the rear brakes, they still got front brakes in it because the bias bar, the balance bar, has not been correctly installed in the car. That's something I feel like every racer should check. If the bias bar or the balance bar is put in the car correctly, it ought to have between 18 and 22 turns, full front to full rear. And if it doesn't, then the ball's not centered correctly. And to check that, see how many turns you got. If you got 20 turns in it, then go 10 turns, go all rear, and then go 10 turns to the front. Lightly touch your brake pedal and see if both rods start moving together at the same time. And sometimes it's kind of hard to tell if it's hitting a plunger in the master or not. So I like taking the lids off the master cylinder, taking the little plastic deflector off, and you can actually see the piston start to move, and it'll have a little bubble in it. When you get those hitting the piston both at the same time, then you're true at 50-50 front to rear brake. Now, another issue sometimes is a cable running to the brake adjuster. They come with a jam nut on them. That jam nut takes about 4 turns of adjustment out of it. So if you've got a brake adjuster that's only got 16 turns in it, if you take that nut off of it, you can have 18 to 20 turns. And I highly recommend doing that and putting some Loctite on that so it doesn't come off if you get it too far.
The nut that comes with the brake pedal assemblies, in everybody's instructions that you read, that nut is to use to jam the bias assembly whenever you can't run a bias crank. There's a lot of sanctioning bodies that won't allow you to run a bias crank. So that jam nut's just to lock the brakes in place so they don't move around while you're racing. They're not to jam the bias crank itself onto the brake pedal assembly. The other thing you can do as far as making sure that bias is set correctly is you want to measure the center to center of the clevis that the push rods screw into. And the center to center of the clevis should be the same distance as center to center to the master cylinders themselves. If that's too narrow or too wide, you're basically just going to lose rounds in your adjuster.
Okay. And you also want to make sure that the rods going from the pedal to the master cylinder initially are set the same length, correct?
Yeah, I like to set them the same length. You can screw out the rear or screw out the front. And all that's really doing is adjusting your pedal position itself. The length of that really doesn't matter as far as adjusting pressures are concerned. The only thing adjusts the pressures is the bore size of the master cylinder and the ratio between the center of the bearing to the center of the clevis of the rear versus the center of the bearing to the center of the clevis of the front master cylinder. So yeah, you can adjust the lengths. I like to keep them just equal length to keep everything as square as possible.
For more information on this or any other AFCO products, check us out at afcoracing.com.